The Keynesians look at government as an enabler of prosperity. And the way they do this is through increasing demand, right? They don't look at problems in economics as an absence of supply. They look at it as an absence of demand, right? There's just not enough demand. People aren't buying enough. We need more buying. And so they want to focus on things that stimulate demand. And they think, well, let's have government spend money, let's have government print money, and we're going to have demand. But what they don't understand is demand without supply means nothing. And they don't understand the difference between the legitimate demand and desire, because you don't have to stimulate desire. I mean, everybody wants everything, right? It's not like I need to be stimulated to want stuff. I want all kinds of things. The limiting factor is what I can afford. And the government can't make things more affordable by creating money. What makes things more affordable is greater production that brings down the cost, right? When cell phones first came out, if you remember the first cell phone in the 1980s, really, these things cost thousands of dollars to buy back then, and to use them was very expensive. I mean, I remember when I got my first cell phone, I barely used it, and if someone called me, I would be really quick because it was so expensive to make the call. But what increased the demand for cell phones wasn't people wanting them more, because everybody wanted one. It was a question of, could you afford it? The reason everybody has them now isn't because the demand for cell phones went up. It's because the price went down, because production went up, because businesses became so much more efficient at producing cell phones that they became affordable to everybody. It wasn't just Gordon Gekko who could afford a cell phone. It was everybody. It was his maid that could afford a cell phone. And so the Austrians recognize a basic economic principle that supply is what creates demand, that you can't demand something that hasn't first been produced. And so government can't stimulate production by stimulating demand. Demand gets stimulated all by itself simply through the productive process. And if there's a bunch of goods that aren't being consumed, all that has to happen is the price has to be allowed to fall. And now they're going to get bought. You don't have to print more money to stimulate those sales. Just let prices come down to the point where people can afford it. But you have Keynesians now. They seem to think that the worst thing that can happen to prices is that they go down.
Yeah,
right? They think, we need government to prevent prices from going down. Why? Prices, they try to argue that, if prices go down, nobody will buy anything, which is a bunch of nonsense. I just talked about cell phones. I mean, the reason that we're buying cell phones is because the price went down. I remember the first time I saw a high-def television. I walked into like a Good Guys or one of these places.
$10,000 back then.
It was $10,000. The first one I saw was $10,000. And it wasn't even a big screen. It was maybe like 28 inches. I don't remember, 32 inches. And it was $10,000. But I remember looking at it and I was amazed. I was like, it's like looking through a window, right? Compared to what I had back then. I really would have liked that television set, but I didn't want to spend $10,000 to buy it. I didn't like it that much. It wasn't $10,000. The first television sets that came out in the 1940s, the sets themselves were like a huge piece of furniture, but the screen was about 2 or 3 inches. It was only black and white. And the first television set was as much money as a car. Who bought it? Really, really rich people that bought it just so they could tell their friends. What could you watch? There was like 2 hours of programming on CBS, and you had to watch within a certain window of time to even see it. I mean, but now everybody has multiple TVs because they're dirt cheap, right? So the idea that nobody will buy television sets if the prices go down is nonsense. The only reason we all have them is because the price goes down. Everybody who buys a computer today knows if they just wait a year, they can buy a better one for less money. So why do people buy computers? Because they don't want to wait a year. They want it right now. The Keynesians don't understand the time value of things. They think that we will wait indefinitely to buy something at a lower price if we think the price is going to go down. No, the only reason people don't buy something waiting for a lower price is because they can't afford it. And so they wait for the price to come down to the point where they can afford it. But if the price never goes down, they'll never buy because they'll never be able to afford it.
Peter, so you're talking about electronics right now. Why is it that the price of things like electronics for, quality is just gone down tremendously? I mean, like you said, the first Walkman was $300 and something dollars. In those dollars, you adjust for inflation, it's like $800. I could probably find a cassette player on Amazon right now for $5 or $10. Why is it that electronic prices have gone down, but the cost of things like education and healthcare has exploded?
Well, because education and healthcare are heavily subsidized by the U.S. government. So anything that the U.S. government gets involved in, the price is going to go up. I mean, that's how government works. They subsidize things. If the government was involved in consumer electronics, the same thing would be happening. I mean, if the government was guaranteeing loans so that people can borrow money to buy computers, computer prices would have gone up instead of down, and people would have all kinds of debt, related to this. I mean, you can see if you look at medicine, because it's really easy, because you could take a look at medicine where the government is involved and where it's not. You could take a look at cosmetic procedures. Like you could look at orthodonture, right? What it costs to put braces on your kids' teeth. Braces today are a fraction of what they cost 20, 30, 40 years ago. The same thing with eye LASIK surgery, which, you can get your eyes fixed at a fraction of the cost of what the same procedure cost 20, 30 years ago. And even all cosmetic procedures, breast implants, liposuction, all this stuff is cheaper. And the reason is because there is a free market in it. There is no government subsidy to get these procedures. There's no insurance and third-party payer, which is only there because of government's the tax law, where people get insurance tax-free. If you have a job and your employer pays you a salary, you pay income taxes. But if he gives you insurance, it's tax-free. So that has created an artificial demand for people to prefer insurance to cash. And so then instead of getting cash and then buying medical care, they get insurance, and then they run everything through a third party, which has dramatically increased the cost of basic medical care. I mean, things that used to be very inexpensive, back in the 1940s and 1950s. I mean, if you had a baby, you could go to the hospital, for 2 weeks and have a baby, and the average guy could afford it, no problem. I mean, you didn't need insurance. And now you go and you get a baby, you're out of the hospital the next day because it's so damn expensive. And it costs, like a brand new car because everybody pays for it with insurance. I mean, if medical treatment used to be inexpensive in this country before the government got involved in subsidizing it. The same thing with education. I mean, my father went to college. He didn't borrow any money to go to college. And he came from a relatively poor family. So how did my father pay for college? He had a summer job. He waited tables over the summers, and that's all it took. And based on doing that, he could pay all of his tuition, all of his room and board. It didn't cost his parents any money, and he worked his way through college, just like most of his friends. I mean, that was a common thing, to work your way through college if your parents couldn't afford to pay. And by the way, it wasn't expensive. So if your parents were upper middle class, it was no big deal to pay for college. But if they were lower middle class or upper lower class, all right, the kids got a job. It was no big deal. Why is college so expensive today? Because the government is so heavily involved in subsidizing college and in in paying for college and making loans for college. But if the government was not involved in any way in college, if there was no government scholarships, if there were no government guaranteed loans, college would be much cheaper today than it was when my dad went, because of all of the advances that there's been. I mean, when my dad went to college, they didn't even have photocopy machines. I mean, let alone computers. I mean, they were so inefficient back then. if you take a look at all the tools we have today, plus a lot more people are going to college now than when my dad went. When my dad went to college, probably 10% of the high school grads went to college. Now it's probably 50% or 60%, something like that. There's something called economies of scale. If when my dad went to college, the average class had, 50 people, and now the average lecture has 500 people, it should be cheaper per person. If we're educating a lot more people, then the cost per person should be going way down, not up, especially when you consider all of the advancements that colleges have today to make them more efficient that did not exist 70 years ago. So if you got government completely out of education, college tuition would implode. It would be so cheap to go. It's only government. Anything the government gets involved in, you can see it. It becomes extremely expensive. The free market lowers costs and increases quality. The government does the opposite. It reduces quality and increases cost.
So